So many of you may know that I came back to this area after living away in New York for 10 years in ministry. I'm back now studying at the Canon Law Department of the Law School at Catholic University of America. And this is my second year in the Canon Law School program, but it was my first year going to the Canon Law Society of America convention in Albuquerque just a couple weeks ago with over 400 canon lawyers. Try not to get jealous. But one of the things that I noticed when I got out there was first I rented a car, and they told me what spot, to go to get the car. And I get in the car, and I can't turn it on. I don't know how to turn it on. It's not working. I can't figure it out. I'm getting very frustrated. Eventually, I figure out how to turn it on, and then I realize I don't know how to make the GPS work. I realized two things in that moment. One, I'm in an electric car, and I didn't know that. I had no idea what that was, how to make it work. Two, how dependent I was on the GPS. Now, I used to be a guy who could get anywhere, kind of with my own sense of direction. Eagle Scout, I thought, and if I had been there once, for sure I could get back, maybe write a few directions down the first time, that kind of thing. I was helpless without that GPS. And I had a real problem with that because I'm a pretty not so techie guy. I carry a flip phone. Last week, before I was here, on Saturday, I had been down in North Carolina for a wedding of one of my former students. And I thought, well, that'll be a nice ride. Well, it could be, because I don't know about you, I hate 95. Hate it. So I went on to figure out a way to take a nicer ride down there. I couldn't tell you how many times I wrote it all down. I missed turns, exits, and everything else. Just to even get to the nice road took me forever in the first place. I realized how dependent I was on this particular way of getting around. So, what does that have to do with anything? In the readings today, we hear right out of the chute, we hear Jesus talking about how when that day comes and the Son of Man comes, second coming, all this stuff, the stars and the moon and the sun, blacked out. They're going to go dark. The winds, all that. Now, for a lot of us, this, we hear it. It's like this sort of ominous darkness. And we've got that kind of vibe going on because we're also reading apocalyptic literature, right? Apocalyptic. But I think we frequently miss. We get the energy, and it ends up being a little misdirected. When we're talking about an apocalypse, it's a Greek word that means to unveil, the apocalypsis, to unveil something, right? And that when Jesus is referring to the stars and the moon and the sun and how that's all going to go dark, he's talking about their GPS system. This would be very easily lost on us, but not on his audience at his time. He's talking about the very ways in which people figure out how to get around. That's why he's talking about them. It's not like, oh, by the way, and also, this is the point, right? The very things that we use, that we know, that orient us to get around, don't count on them. You're going to get very disoriented when the Lord comes, the Son of Man comes on high and all that stuff, right? And that's what's being revealed is the Son of Man. And so Jesus is constantly trying to tell us to be patient and pay attention. Patient and pay attention. He makes it very clear that these are tough times. And sometimes we want to avoid going through those difficult moments. I get that. But think about a caterpillar, right? When a caterpillar goes into the cocoon, whatever you call that process, there's a word for it, I don't remember. When the caterpillar transforms, right, into the butterfly, you might, little kids oftentimes too will be kind of tempted to kind of maybe advance the process along, right? You can start to see a little movement maybe, but poor thing can't get out of there. Maybe it's not ready. And what happens if we do advance that process along? It ends. It's not helpful. We try to be helpful maybe to the caterpillar. Really what we're serving is our own whatever, and it ends up putting the whole thing in danger, and it ends. Roadblocks. Another thing, roadblocks are detours. They're not the end of the journey. They don't stop the journey. The difficult things that get in our way sometimes become the very thing that help us to reorient. And so what is it that we're trying to reorient? We're trying to be reminded to reorient ourselves towards Christ. That Christ, we're at the end of our church's calendar year. We're coming to the very end. Just like with New Year's, just like with a fiscal calendar, when we're getting to the end of that one, we're projecting what we need to do to be able to make things happen for the next one, whether it's a New Year's resolution about our health, or I don't know about you, but I paid to go to a gym that I don't go to. Things like not nearly as much as I should, but it all comes from these ideas like we're going to do something better. And that is the human experience that Jesus is tapping into today to remind us of that. And frequently, what do we do when we get disoriented and uncomfortable? We get disoriented and uncomfortable, and so we want to return to something that's familiar. We don't necessarily want to be patient. We don't necessarily want to persevere. We start to dream about the good old days. We start to do all that kind of stuff. Or we start to project into the future all of this apocalyptic-like energy. And God knows we've gone through a lot of that. In fact, every 4 years we go through that, regardless of whether or not our long-term memory remembers that. But every so many years we go through, if this happens and that result, or this or that, I'm going to move to another country. Right? I would know nobody in this country if people actually made good on those promises in the course of my lifetime. Like we get all worked up and we get very upset, sometimes scared, sometimes, whatever. But the fact of the matter is, we can't tell the future, and Jesus is reminding us of that too. He's saying, the day's going to come when all this stuff the carpet's going to be ripped out from underneath you, but you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay if you have developed that capacity to use me, Jesus, as your compass. Think about it. What are we talking about when we're talking about the end of the world? We're talking about the coming of Christ in his fullness and glory. What's bad about that? Like, really, what's bad about that? How could that go wrong? Then what are we worried about? What are we worried about? Jesus is asking us that all the time. What are you worried about? What do you care about? What does he often tell us? Be not afraid. Be not afraid. I go with you always. Can you imagine if we could have as much faith in Christ taking us to where we're supposed to be as I do, maybe you too, in my GPS doing the same? But I do know that without my GPS, even though I might screw stuff up, I'll figure it out. I firmly believe that if we were to just not have Christ, if we just shut that off, we would not figure it out. And then we would get lost in fear. We would get lost in frustration, distress, all the rest of it. These are feelings. Feelings are not right or wrong. Jesus had them all, so they can't be bad. It's what we do with them that matters. Our roadblocks are detours. They're not destinations. We have the capacity to draw deep into way before we could read a GPS, way before we could read a map, way before we could really even understand that our lives had consequences. Many of us, if not possibly all of us in this room, had faith. I can remember having faith as a small child and not knowing nearly as much about that faith as I do today. Can you identify with that, perhaps, yourselves? We had faith before we had money. We had faith before we had bills. We had faith before we knew we had friends. If we could dig deep, whether or not we opened that gift, we had received it. the gift of faith. And our job is to continue to renew in that faith. Just like in the GPS, if you don't update it every so often, you ever have that happen? It says you're like driving in a lake or off the road or whatever when you're on the road, because it doesn't recognize the new road. If we want to hold on to the way we do things, period, no matter what happens when something beyond our control pops up and we don't like it? Or we don't know what to do. That's dig deep. That's the moment to dig deep. And remember that even in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of all of our struggle, even in the midst of what seems like total darkness, even when I think I'm lost, Christ is alive. Christ exists long before whatever drama we're going through now, will exist long after, and is the best investment we can make with our faith, with our trust, and with our hope. And I would argue that it can be very hard to trust with that kind of faith in a God who we say is absolutely generous love. And it can be hard, I think, to trust in that kind of faith because we rarely see that kind of love witnessed to in one another. And that is our truest vocation as Catholic Christians, to be the image and likeness of God in the world, to bring that presence of Christ to those that we meet, whether it's those that are under our roof or beyond. And that is not an easy thing to do, and Jesus knew it wouldn't be, and that is why he gives us these sacraments. So that we can come in here maybe a little worse for wear after a whole week of doing all the stuff that life has demanded. That we can come in and pause and reflect and pray and hear and celebrate and eat and drink and commune, common union with one another, so that we can be strengthened and fed for this journey out there that will wear us down until we come back and do it all over again next week. Christ is more powerful than any GPS, than any financial statement, than any political party, he's bigger than all of it. And if we could put as much faith and trust in that as we do in any one of those particular tools or identities, never mind all of them, imagine how different our world would be. It would not be so hard to believe in a God who just loves if we saw a world that did the same.